In a heavily guarded wing of the National Security Agency, an elite team of American cryptanalysts sat hunched over printouts, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of green monitors. For weeks, they had been feeding intercepted Soviet diplomatic transmissions into an experimental decryption system. Each one looked like meaningless code rows of numbers, symbols, and characters encrypted by what was considered the Soviet Union's most secure cipher. It was known among intelligence circles as uncrackable. But that morning was different. A subtle pattern had emerged, hidden deep within the chaos of encrypted digits. The machine flagged it. Analysts recalculated, and then it happened. A complete sentence in Russian materialized on the screen. It wasn't garbled. It wasn't an accident. It was real. A KGB diplomatic message, decrypted for the first time. Silence fell across the room. One analyst whispered, "We got it." This wasn't just a win for American cryptography. It was a turning point in the Cold War. The message was ordinary, a mundane update between Soviet embassies. But its implications were anything but. For the first time, U.S. intelligence could read Soviet diplomatic traffic as if they were sitting inside the Kremlin. What followed was immediate escalation. Secure channels buzzed as intelligence chiefs briefed the Pentagon and the White House. The Soviets had no idea their encrypted lines had been compromised. That secrecy, that illusion of invisibility, was what gave them confidence. And now, without even realizing it, they were exposed. The day the code died wasn't marked by explosions or political declarations. It was marked by a quiet revelation. The Americans were reading their mail. And in the world of espionage, that meant the Soviets had already lost a battle they didn't know had begun. The Soviets had long believed that their diplomatic encryption was beyond breach. Their cipher systems were the product of decades of refinement, a complex symphony of codebooks, one-time pads, and advanced cryptographic hardware. To KGB engineers, their ciphers were not just tools. They were symbols of superiority. American intelligence, in their view, lacked the resolve and brilliance to crack such mathematical fortresses. The pride stemmed from experience. During World War II, the Soviet Union had witnessed the devastating impact of broken codes, both their own and those of their enemies. Afterward, they invested heavily in encryption, creating layers of complexity that only the most elite minds could decipher, and even then, only with the proper keys. Unlike the Germans, who underestimated Allied cryptographers at Bletchley Park, the Soviets vowed never to make the same mistake. But arrogance has its cost. By the late 1970s, their systems had grown rigid. Cipher protocols were reused. Patterns began to emerge in some embassies. Complacency led to procedural lapses, reused one-time pads, sloppy key exchanges, and subtle fingerprints left in messages. These oversights, invisible to Soviet eyes, were treasure maps to Jung's codebreakers. Meanwhile, American cryptographers, many of them mathematicians recruited straight from top universities, worked in silence, sifting through endless strings of Soviet chatter. They built software to test combinations, compared intercepted messages side by side, and tracked anomalies so small they seemed insignificant. Over time, those anomalies formed patterns, and patterns led to breakthrough. The KGB's confidence had become its greatest vulnerability. As American systems improved and computing power increased, the impenetrable walls of the Soviet cipher began to crumble, stone by stone, key by key. It wasn't brute force that cracked the code. It was patience, precision, and a deep understanding of human error, the one flaw no machine could ever remove. in a windowless room deep within the National Security Agency. A small team of cryptanalysts sat hunched over screens, chasing shadows in streams of Soviet data. They had no guarantees of success. Most of what they intercepted appeared as random, gibberish encrypted blocks with no clear start or end. Yet, somewhere within that chaos, the Americans believed a door existed. All they needed was a crack wide enough to pry it open. That crack came unexpectedly. It began with a single misstep, a reused one-time pad by a Soviet embassy in South America. These pads were designed to be used only once, ensuring perfect secrecy. But a logistical error forced the reuse of a pad over two different diplomatic messages. For the Soviets, it was a minor convenience. For the NSA, it was a lightning bolt. By comparing the two encrypted messages side by side, analysts began to extract portions of plain text. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to suggest vocabulary, sentence structure, and even encryption methods. This partial decryption, known internally as the peel, gave analysts a glimpse into the Soviet cipher's inner workings. The breakthrough grew from there. As the NSA fed more intercepted messages into their models, the software began to recognize deeper linguistic patterns, not just in code, but in the way Soviet diplomats communicated. Names, locations, dates, and even standard greetings became the skeleton, keys to a broader framework. The Americans weren't just reading one message. They were deciphering a language. This moment, though quiet, marked a seismic shift in the Cold War's intelligence war. U.S. analysts didn't announce the breakthrough to the world. Doing so would mean losing access. Instead, they kept reading. Each message pulled from the Soviet network was treated like a rare manuscript, filed, analyzed, and passed discreetly to decision-makers in Washington. From that point on, the U.S. was no longer blind to Soviet plans. The enemy's words were no longer hidden behind mathematical walls. They were plain, vulnerable, and most importantly, useful. Armed with the ability to read Soviet diplomatic communications nearly in real time, the United States gained an edge that had previously only been a dream. Every transmission sent from Soviet embassies, intelligence outposts, or even high-level government offices was now a potential leak, not from a spy, but from the Soviet Union itself. This wasn't just about eavesdropping on routine chatter. American analysts now knew when Soviet leaders planned to meet with allies, when arms shipments were scheduled, or when diplomatic pressure was being applied to neutral countries. The intelligence wasn't speculative. It was concrete, pulled directly from the enemy's own cables. As the Cold War entered some of its most volatile years, this window into Soviet intentions proved invaluable. During the arms control negotiations, U.S. diplomats walked into talks already knowing the limits of Soviet compromise. In proxy conflicts like Angola or Afghanistan, Washington anticipated KGB strategies days before they unfolded on the ground. Military planners could read discussions between Soviet generals and foreign defense ministries, giving them a real-time view of troop movements, weapon transfers, and logistical coordination. It was like playing a chess match while secretly seeing your opponent's strategy notes before each move. But this advantage came with a risk. It had to remain invisible. The moment the Soviets realized their codes were compromised, the entire operation would collapse. That meant American responses had to be subtle, indirect, never tipping their hand too early, even if lives were at stake. This balancing act, leveraging deep intelligence without revealing its source, became one of the defining challenges of the Cold War intelligence game. But when played right, it changed everything. Soviet commanders often reacted with confusion, unaware that their strategies were being anticipated with uncanny accuracy. They blamed leaks, spies, or internal betrayal. They never suspected that the betrayal was digital, hiding in their most trusted lines of communication. The breakthrough in cryptanalysis had remained one of the best-kept secrets in U.S. intelligence for years, but secrecy is a fragile shield. Eventually, subtle shifts in the behavior of Western powers began to arouse suspicion in the Soviet camp. Operations that had once gone unnoticed were now being intercepted. Diplomatic strategies were consistently anticipated. Worst of all, internal Soviet deliberations were somehow being countered before they could even be acted upon. The moment of realization didn't come from a single incident. It was a creeping dread, a growing awareness among senior KGB chiefs that their innermost communications were no longer private. Analysts in Moscow began to trace patterns, and alarm bells rang when too many covert initiatives failed mysteriously. Something was wrong, something unseen. An internal investigation was launched. Starting with the assumption of internal betrayal, agents were questioned, files were scoured, counterintelligence teams hunted for moles. But nothing surfaced. No traitors, no signs of leaks. Then came the terrifying possibility. What if it wasn't a human weakness, but a systemic one? What if the codes themselves had been broken? This hypothesis was initially met with disbelief. Soviet encryption systems were considered virtually impenetrable. Their confidence had been based on the complexity of the cipher machines and the strength of their protocols, but the evidence was mounting and damning. When confirmation finally came through a combination of intercepted signals and Western behavior that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, the shock in Moscow was seismic. The very backbone of their secure communication had been compromised. Every message they thought had been sent in confidence had possibly been read by their greatest adversary. The realization triggered panic across the Soviet intelligence community. Emergency code revisions were rushed into development. Cipher machines were overhauled. But the damage had already been done. Years of strategic planning, covert operations, and diplomatic maneuvering had been exposed, catalogued, and analyzed, all without their knowledge. The Cold War had been fought in the shadows. But the Soviets now understood that for a very long time, they had been walking in the dark while their enemy had seen everything. The revelation that America had cracked their diplomatic codes sent shockwaves through every level of the Soviet hierarchy. The KGB, once seen as an impenetrable fortress of espionage, was now viewed with suspicion from within. Senior officials were furious not just at the Americans, but at their own failure to detect the breach earlier. What was once a culture of confidence quickly turned into one of fear, blame, and frantic overcorrection. Strategic plans that had been in motion for years were suddenly thrown into chaos. Political maneuvers, covert operations, and diplomatic initiatives had to be reevaluated from the ground up. Every interaction with the West was now viewed through the lens of possible exposure. Had the Americans been reacting out of insight or foresight? Had any recent negotiations been influenced by information they weren't supposed to have? The psychological impact on Soviet leadership was devastating. Trust in their own security systems plummeted. New codes were introduced at lightning speed, but the confidence that had once fueled their international strategy had evaporated. A chilling uncertainty hung over every decision, and in a regime built on secrecy, that uncertainty was paralyzing. At the strategic level, paranoia surged. Every success by the West military, political or diplomatic, was now reinterpreted as possibly the result of intelligence derived from cracked Soviet codes. The Soviet Union was forced to admit that it had been operating at a severe disadvantage for years, not because of weaker ideology or inferior tactics, but because their adversaries had been reading their thoughts. In the broader Cold War context, this shifted the balance. The Kremlin could no longer rely on secure communication channels to coordinate with allies or execute covert plans. Every message had to be considered a potential liability. This forced the Soviets to retreat into even tighter information control, sacrificing operational agility for security. In a war of shadows, they had lost their cloak and were now scrambling for cover. The breach of the Soviet diplomatic codes had consequences that echoed far beyond the confines of intelligence bunkers and command centers. When it became evident that American analysts had been silently eavesdropping on sensitive Soviet communications, the global diplomatic community took notice. Allies of the Soviet Union began questioning the security of their own communications with Moscow, wondering if they too had been inadvertently exposed. Inside the Kremlin, relationships with client states and satellite nations grew tense. Governments that once trusted Soviet diplomatic channels now suspected that their internal affairs might have been compromised. Some began quietly distancing themselves from Moscow, re-evaluating the extent of their cooperation. Others demanded enhanced security assurances, which the Soviet leadership could no longer confidently provide. The Americans, for their part, were cautious not to publicly reveal how deep the compromise went, but certain geopolitical moves, such as remarkably precise counter-strategies in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, began to make more sense in hindsight. The Soviet Union's opponents seemed one step ahead too often for it to be coincidence. Internationally, the breach damaged Soviet credibility. Diplomats now faced skeptical counterparts at every negotiation table. Was the Soviet ambassador delivering a genuine message, or one that had already been read and countered before it was spoken? This uncertainty weakened the USSR's position in arms control talks, trade discussions, and multilateral diplomacy. In a final twist of irony, the very tools the Soviets had relied on to project power and influence across the world, their embassies, encrypted communiques, and secret channels had become instruments of their own unraveling. The diplomatic reverberations of the code-breaking scandal underscored a brutal truth of Cold War politics. Information was the ultimate weapon, and in this battle, the Soviets had been disarmed without even knowing it. The KGB's failure wasn't one of negligence. It was one of total systemic blindness. In the months after suspecting that their communications might have been compromised, the Soviet Union unleashed its full intelligence arsenal. GRU deployed field advisors to every major embassy, swept rooms for bugs, and tore apart radio logs. Captured wreckage was dissected. Scrambled messages were re-scrambled, and hundreds of man-hours poured into code auditing. But the leaks didn't stop. Worse, they couldn't even find them. Simultaneously, the KGB sent out an expanded human operation, human intelligence networks carefully placed in NATO capitals, defense contracting firms, and even Washington, D.C. But nothing they received explained how, when, or where the Americans had cracked their systems. The reason, the nature of the breach was beyond the Soviet framework of understanding. Their institutional mindset, one shaped by physical sabotage and human infiltration, was fatally incompatible with the digital age's cryptographic warfare. The American success had been constructed across a deeply classified, compartmentalized network. The NSA had been authorized black budget programs whose details were known to perhaps fewer than 50 people. Communications were intercepted, not at the embassy wall, but from satellites in orbit, from underwater cable taps, and from tiny signal anomalies picked up by stations operating far outside the Soviet radar range. Even when the Soviets tried to audit how their own codes had been broken, they misinterpreted everything. They believed it must be from a physical compromise, a stolen cipher machine, a defecting agent, a bribed technician. They couldn't imagine that computational breakthroughs like frequency analysis powered by early supercomputers or mathematical exploits in the encryption algorithms themselves could be the source. And in their final report, the most damning line wasn't a statement. It was a question, handwritten in red across the margins, if they can read everything. What don't they know by the end of the investigation? Both the GRU and KGB had effectively gone blind, searching in the wrong dimensions, chasing ghosts in walls, while the true breach had passed through the circuits and electrons they never learned to fear. They were looking at a ghost. The decryption of Soviet diplomatic codes did more than just embarrass the KGB. It reshaped the global chessboard of Cold War geopolitics. With unprecedented access to the inner workings of Soviet diplomacy, American intelligence agencies could now monitor real-time communications between Moscow and its embassies around the world. This allowed the U.S. to track Soviet negotiations, arms deals, and political maneuvering across Africa, Latin America, and Asia before they even came to fruition. This advantage wasn't theoretical in several cases. The U.S. was able to intercept secret agreements between the Soviet Union and emerging governments, then respond diplomatically or militarily before the Soviets could establish a foothold. Entire regimes changed course once Washington confronted them with irrefutable proof of their dealings with Moscow, proof gathered silently through intercepted and decrypted messages. The impact extended into nuclear strategy as well. For the first time, American leadership could distinguish between Soviet bluff and intent. When tensions rose, such as during missile deployments or military exercises, these decrypted messages revealed whether Soviet commanders were simply posturing or preparing for escalation. This intelligence was critical in preventing miscalculations that could have led to catastrophic conflict. Ultimately, the breach in Soviet communications led to a crisis of trust within the USSR. KGB officials began suspecting double agents everywhere. Internal purges and reshuffling of diplomatic personnel followed. But the damage was done. The strategic edge had shifted for years. Soviet leaders believed they were operating from a position of strength, when in fact, their every move was being anticipated by their adversary. This wasn't just a tactical win, it was a strategic turning point. The decryption of Soviet diplomatic codes marked one of the most significant intelligence victories of the Cold War, allowing the United States to outmaneuver the Soviet Union on the global stage with precision and foresight. When the truth emerged that the United States had been reading their diplomatic cables for years, panic spread through the highest levels of the KGB. The initial reaction was disbelief. How could a system they considered airtight be compromised so thoroughly? But once the evidence was undeniable, the scramble to contain the fallout began immediately. The KGB initiated a full-scale internal investigation, hunting for traitors, leaks, or software flaws that may have enabled the breach. Cipher departments were overhauled overnight, and thousands of encrypted messages were recalled or invalidated. They began replacing diplomatic encryption systems, but the process was slow and cumbersome, made worse by bureaucratic delays and technological limitations. In the meantime, the KGB directed all Soviet embassies to shift to verbal communication wherever possible. Ambassadors were ordered to avoid transmitting sensitive information by cable which paralyzed diplomatic channels and forced a return to Cold War-era courier networks. The fear of continued leaks forced Soviet officials to operate in a state of paranoia, questioning every transmission and distrusting their own communication systems. The psychological impact on Soviet intelligence officers was severe. A shadow of doubt loomed over every secure line and radio frequency. Field agents hesitated to carry out operations, unsure whether the Americans were listening. The KGB, once feared for its ruthless precision, now found itself on the defensive, second-guessing every step and burdened by the constant threat of exposure. Despite their efforts, the damage had already been done. The breach forced the Soviet Union to confront a harsh truth. Their technological edge in cryptography had eroded, and with it, their control over the narrative of international diplomacy. It was a rare moment in Cold War history where information, not firepower, decided the balance of power. The revelation that American cryptographers had quietly undermined Soviet diplomatic security triggered a dramatic shift in Moscow's strategic thinking. For decades, the Soviet Union had relied heavily on secure communication to orchestrate its global network of embassies, covert operatives, and proxy wars. But now, that foundation had been cracked, possibly for years, without their knowledge. In response, the Soviet leadership was forced to reassess how it conducted global affairs. Their emphasis shifted from centralized, long-distance diplomatic control to more compartmentalized, in-person directives. Critical decisions were no longer transmitted by encrypted cable, but instead delivered face-to-face via trusted couriers and loyal agents. It was a regression in operational efficiency, but a necessary sacrifice for security. Technological investment also pivoted. Whereas previously the Soviets believed their encryption methods to be state-of-the-art, the breach shattered that illusion. Suddenly, massive resources were allocated to the development of next-generation cryptographic systems, both hardware and software-based, designed not only to prevent foreign interception, but also to detect and trace attempts at decryption. On the geopolitical front, the Soviets became far more cautious. They began to suspect that much of the West's uncanny ability to anticipate Soviet moves wasn't due to luck or superior strategy, but to stolen information. This changed the tone of their diplomacy and intelligence gathering. Paranoia set in. Trust became a rare currency, even within Soviet institutions. Moreover, this incident sparked an internal debate. Was it better to invest in secrecy, or to sow disinformation that the Americans might unwittingly consume? Some hardliners pushed for deliberate leaks of false cables, hoping to feed Washington, misleading intelligence and muddy future interpretations. In this new game of shadows, deception became a form of defense. Ultimately, the breach of their diplomatic codes didn't just embarrass Soviet intelligence, it forced a fundamental rethinking of how the USSR conducted war, peace, and politics. The battlefield had shifted from tanks and missiles to algorithms and interception, and the Soviets were playing catch-up. The cracking of Soviet diplomatic codes by American intelligence left an indelible mark on the Cold War's strategic landscape. Beyond the immediate panic and reaction, the long-term consequences shaped both Soviet and American intelligence doctrines for decades. For the Soviet Union, the incident exposed a vulnerability they never thought possible. Their belief in the unbreakable nature of their cryptographic systems was shattered. In retrospect, it became clear that their reliance on security through obscurity, assuming that complexity alone would shield their secrets, had failed. As a result, Soviet engineers and cryptographers were forced to adopt a new philosophy rooted in redundancy, auditing, and continual adaptation. One key lesson: even the most advanced codes are not immune to human error. Much of the American success came not only from technical brilliance, but from exploiting flaws in implementation, careless operators, reused cipher keys, and predictable patterns. The Soviet leadership realized that technology alone could not compensate for lapses in discipline and operational security. For the United States, the operation underscored the immense value of signals intelligence, not just in military operations, but in shaping diplomatic strategy. With real-time insights into Soviet intentions, American leaders were able to anticipate moves, shape negotiations, and avoid traps that might have otherwise escalated into conflict. It validated years of investment into code-breaking and surveillance infrastructure. At a broader level, the event highlighted a new reality in modern warfare. Information was as powerful as any bomb or missile. The Cold War was no longer just a race of arsenals. It was a contest of minds, machines, and silent victories. The battleground extended into cyberspace long before the term existed, and the seeds of today's intelligence warfare were planted. Looking back, historians and analysts now view this episode not only as a moment of Cold War brinkmanship, but as a critical inflection point. It was a reminder that in a world of encrypted secrets and global tension, the first to break the silence often holds the advantage, and in this case, that advantage belonged to the United States, leaving the Soviet KGB scrambling to rebuild trust in a system that had already been compromised from within.